Hey there, fellow horse lovers. Welcome back to the Daily Ride podcast. My name is Morgan. I am your host, and today I'm excited to get into an interesting topic with you: stress. Stress is something that we all experience in everyday life, and our horses experience stress too. There's a really interesting connection between how horses and humans both can benefit from stress. And in working with horses, I personally have been more aware of a concept called the stress threshold. And the stress threshold concept is really important to understand from not just a training perspective, but I think in a self regulation perspective in the rest of our everyday lives. But horses also experience stress too. And not all stress is bad, but what happens when we exceed what we call our stress threshold? And how can we cope with returning back to normal and regulating ourselves? In working with horses, there's a really interesting concept called the stress threshold. I'm excited to spend some time today talking about what it is, what to do when we exceed it, and how to make it work for us, as well as how to make it work for our horses. In fact, when we are more aware of our stress threshold and how we approach and stay mindful of it, we can turn moments that would be highly stressful into opportunities for learning, growth, and resilience, both in our own lives as humans and for our horses on our relationship with horses. Some interesting research about how stress can actually be beneficial for learning, how stress affects our brain and our horses' brains. And I'd like to get into some strategies to help us reset after we've been overwhelmed by stress or we've crossed our stress threshold. Whether you're working with horses, teaching others, teaching yourself, or just trying to navigate everyday life, this is a concept that you won't want to miss. As always, the Daily Ride podcast directly supports True Heart Healing. True Heart Healing is my nonprofit organization. We aim to support veterans, active duty service members, children with disabilities and/or life-altering illnesses and their families to provide a healing environment by partnering with horses and leveraging the joy and support that comes with equine companionship to help individuals develop life skills, practice their own healing, and embark on their own healing journey, find hope, and discover purpose. If this is something you would like to support, please find us at www.the-daily-ride.com and make a donation. True Heart and I deeply appreciate your support. Stress. So when I hear this word stress, my shoulders start creeping up towards my ears. I have such a visceral reaction to feeling stressed, which is interesting because I feel like in my personal life, I operate off of a level of baseline stress to begin with. But in being aware of this word, I don't know of anyone that thinks stress is much of a positive connotation. I think stress overall comes with a negative connotation for most of us. But there's been some interesting research supporting that a little bit of stress is actually really beneficial. And this is known as the Yerkes-Dodson law. This was based upon research done in 1908 by, of course, Yerkes and Dodson. They demonstrated that some stress can help support performance. Up to a point, however. If you become too stressed, that stress response actually is correlated to negative performance. And Yerkes and Dodson demonstrated that performance will actually increase in quality with a little stress up to a specific point, after which your performance will decline. So think of it like paying attention. A little bit of attention, a little bit of stress, a little bit of alertness can help sharpen our focus. However, too much of it can lead to frustration, panic, mistakes, and really dangerous situations, especially when we're working with animals that are 10 times our size. So Yerkes and Dodson found that optimal level of stress, that little bit of psychological arousal or alertness, they called this the zone of proximal development. And in educational theory, this is the level of stress that actually helps benefit people because we are challenged enough to pay attention to increase our executive functioning. So our brain's command center of inhibiting impulses, paying attention to things, our short-term memory, all of that is challenged and alert and running optimally because we're a little bit more aroused, we're a little bit stressed, but it's still supported enough to succeed because we're not past that stress threshold. The stress threshold is the point of stress where it's the tipping point where you are no longer just stressed enough to be alert, but you are now becoming overwhelmed with stress. And that stress threshold is the point at which the more stressed you become, the less you are able to perform well. In fact, this is especially true when we're working with horses as well as ourselves, because once we pass that stress threshold, our brain will shift over from our prefrontal cortex or higher order thinking and our ability to reason logically and rationally, and our brain will actually switch over into our fight or flight brain, which is our amygdala, our lizard brain, as is commonly known in pop psychology these days. And so it's really important to understand what exactly indicates that we are in our zone of proximal development level of stress, when our horses are in that zone of proximal development level of stress, and when we're approaching our stress threshold where suddenly we have too much stress and our brain actually starts working against us in terms of learning and performance. And this isn't just old psychological research. Since 1908, there has been much modern research confirming this. In fact, in 2018, a study that was published in Trends in Cognitive Sciences emphasized that that moderate level of stress, that zone of proximal development, can enhance memory consolidation and learning because it activates the release of neurotransmitters such as norepinephrine and dopamine. And these are chemicals that help our brain work better. They help us focus and they help us store information. However, that same 2018 study found that once that stress surpasses that optimal zone and gets closer to our stress threshold, again, our cognitive function starts to decline, especially when we're trying to problem solve and regulate our emotions. Okay, so we generally have an idea that a little stress is a good thing. It helps our brain consolidate new information. It helps us commit that information to memory, which, in other words, is learning. But what happens when we get too close to that stress threshold? Our prefrontal cortex, which is the part of our brain that is responsible for decision making, focus, regulating our emotions, essentially gets switched off. It goes offline. Our brain shuts our prefrontal cortex off and switches over to the amygdala. And our amygdala is our inner part of our brain that's responsible for our fight or flight response. The working theory is that the amygdala is the evolutionary older part of the brain, and this allows us quicker responses and reaction times, which from a survival standpoint is really helpful. Our brain is faster at making decisions when we're only working from our amygdala. If we switch into our prefrontal cortex when we are threatened, that requires a couple of extra seconds of conscious thought to allow us to decide, okay, I'm in danger right now. What should I do to get out of it? That thought, that conscious thought takes time, and that cuts down on our reaction time and our ability to avoid dangerous situations. And so, from an evolutionary perspective, when we have crossed our stress threshold, we quit being able to use our thinking rational part of our brain. So, this is really helpful because it helps us react very quickly in dangerous situations to keep our body safe. However, it's not helpful at all when we're trying to learn something new, when we're trying to think rationally and critically, and when we're trying to engage with others on an emotional level. All of which are skills that we need to be able to connect with our horses and work with our horses. In 2019, Hermans, Hankins, Joles, and Fernandez explained in Nature Neuroscience how acute stress impairs our brain's ability to retain and process new information. And they posited that that happens because cortisol, a hormone that we commonly associate with stress, will flood the brain, and this disrupts the neural pathways to our prefrontal cortex. And so when we pass that stress threshold, our brains are not able to access the rational thinking part of our brain. And for horses, this is maybe even more pronounced. When a horse is overstressed, it will also go into its own version of fight or flight mode. And this is different for every horse. This depends on your horse's predisposition, on their previous training, on their personality. In a previous podcast episode, we talked about the understanding of extrovert, introvert, left brain, right brain. And so when a horse is overstressed and they enter their own fight or flight mode, this is when you might see behaviors like bolting away from you, freezing, or completely shutting down and becoming unresponsive, completely going internal. Lights are on, nobody's home. A 2020 study in Equine Veterinary Journal highlighted how that having excessive stress will inhibit learning in horses just like it does with humans. And this was done by Sankey, Henry, and Hausberger in 2020. Horse training in a low-stress environment effects on memory retention. So researchers presented in this paper that when you gradually expose horses to challenges where you are mindful of that stress threshold and you make sure that the learning occurs in a safe environment for the horse, this will allow both the humans and the horses to develop resilience to stress and be able to accomplish their learning outcomes more effectively than they would if it were done in a high-stress environment. Here's the good news. Even after we've been pushed beyond our own stress threshold, there are always ways to recover and reset. So let's talk about how we can help bring our prefrontal cortex, our rational brain, our emotionally regulated brain back online after we've accidentally crossed our stress threshold. A study published in Frontiers in Psychology in 2017 found that slow, deep breathing, sometimes called diaphragmatic breathing, can help reduce cortisol levels in our brain and will increase activity in our prefrontal cortex. So to do this, try inhaling for 4 counts, holding for 4, exhaling for 6. This rhythm and deep breathing will help signal to your brain that it's safe to shift out of survival mode. If you're in danger, if you're running from something that's going to eat you, you aren't going to be breathing slowly and deeply. You're not even going to be thinking about breathing. And so you can help your brain realize that it's safe and turn your prefrontal cortex back on by taking a few minutes for mindful and deep breathing. Mindfulness and meditation is also really helpful with resetting your brain and getting out of that fight or flight mode once you've crossed your stress threshold. Research from Harvard University in 2011 showed that 8 weeks of mindfulness and meditation practice daily will increase your gray matter density in your prefrontal cortex and your hippocampus. And in fact, practicing mindfulness and meditation on a daily basis is also shown over time to have a cumulative effect to stress resilience and bolstering your prefrontal cortex activity and capacity. Research from Harvard University in 2011 showed that after 8 weeks of mindfulness and meditation practice, increased neural density in participants' prefrontal cortex and their hippocampus, which is the area of your brain that is associated with learning and emotional regulation. So taking a few minutes to practice mindfulness and meditation on a daily basis can help develop your brain structure to be more resilient to stress. Physical activity can also be very helpful. In 2013, a study published in Neuropsychologia found that even light physical activity like walking can help reduce stress and re-engage your prefrontal cortex. So moving your physical body can help activate brain regions that are involved in problem solving and emotional regulation. If you are lucky enough to work in a flexible work environment, try taking a quick 2 to 5 minute walk after your next meeting. Or better yet, make your meetings walking meetings if you can. Being able to lightly move your body can help your brain be more resilient to stress and raise your stress threshold so you aren't so easily tipped over it into fight or flight. So what do we do when we accidentally push our horses over their stress threshold? This brings me to a recent experience crossing a stress threshold with True that has been very informative for me and something that I want to be more mindful of going forward. It's wintertime here in Colorado, and as such, we have snow and ample sunshine, which means the ground is somewhere between icy and slippery and slushy and muddy. We aren't always able to go ride in the arena, and riding in general isn't always safe in the wintertime due to the ice on the ground. I'm always worried about True slipping and hurting herself. So we decided to take a walk around the property. Where we're boarded butts up to some woods, and they've recently been cleared out to avoid a fire threat. However, there's usually a lot of deer and elk that will come through the woods on the property, and True's used to seeing deer pretty close to her, as well as the herd of elk that will walk by. True's also used to walking around the house with me. That path is very familiar to her. On this particular afternoon, though, she was on high alert. I don't know if she smelled a bear or a mountain lion or saw something that I couldn't see, but she was quite concerned walking down this path with me. Being that it's also December in Colorado, there was a frozen puddle on the road that we stopped to sniff, and she played with the puddle by cracking the ice with her foot and walking through it. She was really interested in seeing how the ice would crackle, and eventually, after exploring this, she got pretty comfortable with it. However, every time I would try and pull her attention back to me to continue our walk, she would become very alert, constantly scanning the horizon. Her head was on a swivel, her ears were pricked. She sensed something that was very concerning to her. That was her telling me that she's feeling stressed, that something is worrying her, and that she's pretty wound up about it. Since we had walked down this trail so many times before, I kept pushing her to walk forward with me. And in hindsight, knowing what I know now from the research about stress thresholds, I probably should have listened to her telling me that she was nearing her stress threshold and was about to reach that point where she was not able to rationally reason with me or regulate her emotions. And of course, right at this time, a cow elk pops up. She had been bedded down just off the trail, and this was a place that True and I hadn't seen elk before. True had seen a herd of elk walking across the other side of the property, but at a distance. So the appearance of this animal that we weren't used to seeing there kind of sent her over her stress threshold. At first, I helped her breathe. I stuck my finger in the side of her mouth. True, being an introvert, will hold her breath when she's freaking out inside. She won't always physically freak out at me, but I can tell that something is really bothering her when she gets incredibly still and she starts holding her breath. So I've learned to stick my finger in the side of her mouth and get her to lick and chew and open her mouth because my finger's in there, and that will usually help her remember to breathe again. Horses are obligatory nose breathers, but something about moving her tongue around in her mouth reminds her to keep breathing, even though it's only through her nose that she can breathe. I also helped her lower her head with a cookie. Horses, when they lower their head and neck as if to graze, that helps their bodies release endorphins and helps them stay calm. It's kind of like with humans, when we force ourselves to smile, sometimes it actually helps us feel happier. When our body is doing something that indicates an emotion, it's easier to start feeling that emotion. And so helping True lower her neck and assume a body posture that indicates calmness for her, I was hoping would help her stay calm. She was able to take a couple more steps with me, and she kept snorting and kept stopping and kept physically showing me, hey, I'm worried about something in the woods here. I don't know if it's that elk that sent her over, or she might have been smelling a bear. She might have been smelling a mountain lion. I couldn't see what was concerning to her, but she was definitely telling me that she was concerned. And sure enough, a couple seconds after the third time she alerted to me, I was no longer able to get her attention to provide any tricks. This was when she had hit her stress threshold. And for True, she is an introvert, but if I continue to push her after she's over her threshold, she has more of a fight response than a flight response. And she started jumping around and rearing. And unfortunately, she reared so high just to make her point to me, she tripped herself and fell over backwards and rolled over on her butt. At this point, she had rolled over and I'd let go of the rope so as not to hurt her, but she realized she was free and she took off at a dead sprint back to the barn. She was so freaked out. And I think falling over backwards might have scared her even further because I'm not sure if she realized that she had tripped herself. I walked back to the barn. We caught up to her and we did some deep breathing together. She was still quite rattled. And so the best thing that I found to get her to relax a little bit more and reconnect with me and re-engage emotionally was just to stick to things that we had already done before. We ended up playing fetch in order to get her to walk with me back to her pen. And so this aligns perfectly with what we've just discovered in the research. True had been telling me that she was nearing her stress threshold. She needed moments to pause and breathe and take more small, manageable steps. If I were to redo this situation again, I would choose to listen to her telling me after the first or second time that she was nearing her stress threshold, and we would have walked back to the barn and gone a different way. And it's my job to listen to her when she's telling me that something is pushing her close to her stress threshold. I feel terrible that she was so panicked and so worried that she had what she, I'm sure, thought was a near-death experience. But I'm grateful that we had this opportunity to be reminded of what can happen when she's pushed over her stress threshold. And resilience and training isn't just about avoiding stress and avoiding your stress threshold. It's about learning to navigate it and communicate when you're getting close to your stress threshold so you can work together to build your stress resilience using the right tools. So what can we take away from all of this? Stress is not always bad. A little stress can actually enhance learning, but only up to a point. So it's really important to know your personal limit and your horse's limit and aim for that sweet spot. When in doubt, always opt for lower stress environments if you can. Recovery from stress is possible. And in fact, resilience to stress can be built. Even when we're overwhelmed and we accidentally cross over our stress threshold or our horse's stress threshold, techniques like deep breathing, mindfulness, movement, and return to something familiar can help us reset and reconnect with each other. And of course, growth always happens in the aftermath of a stressful situation. This recent incident of me accidentally crossing True's stress threshold helped shed light on what I need to do to support her better, to help her rebuild her stress resilience, and how we can better connect after we make a mistake. I think another important takeaway is to know that every person's stress threshold is unique to them. We all have different past life experiences, especially when those include trauma of some kind. And so to one person, a certain event or situation might not be stressful at all and may trigger and cross over a different person's stress threshold in a matter of seconds. So it's important to spend some time exploring what your stress triggers are and understanding how you can best support yourself. A common phrase I've heard in working with horses is to make the right thing easy and the wrong thing hard. And I think the same can be applied to managing our stress levels and our horses' stress levels. The more you are aware of your own stress resilience and your own stressful triggers in life, the easier it is to set yourself up for success and be mindful of approaching learning and new situations by intentionally creating situations that are low stress. Just like we aim to get to know our horses and set them up for success by creating a low stress learning environment and being mindful of keeping them under their stress thresholds, we can do this for ourselves by understanding what we personally find stressful. Remember, a little stress is actually a good thing. It helps to be alert and intentional, and a little stress helps with focus. The key here is to aim for that sweet spot and understand our own individual needs so that we can set ourselves up for success just like we would our horse. Thanks for joining me today talking about this stressful topic. Remember, growth is just on the other side of whatever near-death experience you feel like you have just survived. Until next time, take good care of yourself and your horses and enjoy the ride.